Claire Hartley stood completely frozen in the Porsche showroom as the service manager closed the repair folder and exhaled slowly. Transmission's gone. You should buy a new car. 3 other dealerships had said the same thing. The Porsche, the last gift her father ever left her, could barely shift gears anymore. In desperation, Claire drove the shuddering car out of the city until it died in front of a weathered roadside garage called Mercer Auto Repair. A single father in an oil-stained shirt stepped out, opened the hood, listened for a few seconds, and said quietly, "Your transmission's perfectly fine."
Your gearbox is perfectly fine.
Why did a struggling mechanic in a rundown garage see what every luxury dealership had missed? The answer will surprise you. Claire Hartley had built her career on precision. As the CEO of a mid-sized logistics company fighting through a brutal quarter, she had learned to trust data, trust reports, trust the experts who carried clipboards and wore pressed shirts and spoke with absolute authority. So when the first Porsche dealership in the city told her the transmission was gone, she believed them. When the second said the same thing, complete transmission failure, full replacement required, not worth saving, she believed them too. By the time a third service manager delivered the same verdict without even lifting his eyes from the diagnostic printout, Claire had stopped asking questions and started doing the math on a replacement vehicle she didn't want and couldn't afford to think about emotionally. The car had belonged to her father. He had bought it the year he retired, a single indulgence after a lifetime of careful spending. He drove it exactly the way he'd lived, steady, controlled, always listening for something wrong before it became a real problem. When he passed 14 months ago, Claire had inherited the house, the watch, and the Porsche. And of the 3, only the Porsche felt like him. Selling it was never a possibility. Entertaining the idea of having it declared worthless by 4 separate service departments in a single week came close to breaking something in her that had nothing to do with machinery. The 4th dealership was Brett Calloway's facility, a sprawling glass and steel Porsche authorized center on the northern edge of downtown, all backlit logos and leather lounges. Brett Calloway himself had walked out to greet her, which should have felt like a courtesy, but felt more like a performance. He was young, aggressively polished, and had the particular kind of confidence that comes not from deep knowledge, but from never having been seriously challenged. He shook Claire's hand, examined the service history, and declared the transmission a total loss within 8 minutes. "It's cheaper to replace the car," he told her, one hand in his jacket pocket, already half turned toward the showroom. "We have a certified pre-owned 7ELE1 in the back. Same generation, better condition." Claire had stared at him for a moment, searching his face for any sign that he understood what he was suggesting. She found none. She left Calloway's dealership with her hands tight on the steering wheel and the car shuddering beneath her every time she tried to accelerate above 30 miles per hour. The anger was clean and cold, the kind that doesn't burn, but accumulates sitting heavy in the chest and pressing outward. The Porsche vibrated through second gear, hesitated violently at third, and occasionally refused to engage fourth at all. 3 different shops had run full diagnostics. 3 different service managers had printed 3 different estimates for a complete transmission swap ranging from $18,000 to $26,000. None of them had found anything they could actually fix. There is something worth pausing on here. 4 separate professionals, each trained, each certified, each operating with the best tools their industry provided, and not one of them found the actual problem. This isn't a story about incompetence. It's a story about what happens when a system is designed to trust its own outputs more than the reality in front of it. When the instrument becomes more authoritative than the evidence, the instrument wins, even when it's wrong. The city thinned out around her as she drove east, following no particular route, just needing to be moving. Then the car lurched once hard, shuddered through what sounded like the entire drivetrain fighting against itself, and died. It coasted to the shoulder of a county road on the outskirts of the city engine, silent dashboard lit orange. Claire sat for a moment, with both hands still on the wheel. Then she looked up and saw not 30 yards ahead on the right a low concrete building half hidden behind a row of overgrown hedges. Hand-painted letters on a faded sign read, "Mercer Auto Repair." The parking lot was cracked and uneven. Two older sedans sat on jack stands near the side wall. A folding metal chair occupied the space beside the front door like a permanent fixture. Nothing about the place suggested it belonged in the same sentence as the Porsche sitting dead on the gravel shoulder. Claire pulled out her phone to call roadside assistance. She had already dialed the first 3 digits when the shop's side door pushed open and a girl of about 12 or 13 stepped out, carefully transferring clean ratchet heads one by one to a pegboard on the outer wall. She set the tray down, looked at the Porsche, looked at Claire, and disappeared back inside without a word. Claire lowered her phone. A minute later, a man came through the same door, lean and unhurried, a broad-shouldered black man wearing a gray work shirt with a name patch on the chest, oil stains running up both forearms in the particular pattern of someone who worked close to machinery rather than merely around it. There was a quiet self-possession about him, the kind that doesn't ask for a room's attention but receives it anyway. He walked to the Porsche without speaking, stood beside the hood for a moment, and then lifted it without asking permission. He didn't reach for a scanner. He didn't pull out a tablet. He stood very still with both hands resting on the edge of the engine bay and listened not to anything Claire could hear, but to something in the faint ticking and settling of the cooling metal in the specific silence of a drivetrain that had just given up under load. After perhaps 15 seconds, the man straightened up and looked at Claire with an expression that was neither diagnostic nor performative. It was simply certain. "Your transmission's perfectly fine," he said. Claire had heard those words only moments before from her own memory of the past week's frustration. But standing on a crumbling asphalt lot at the edge of a city that had already sent her away 4 times, they hit differently. "That's not what Ford dealerships told me," she said. The man glanced back at the engine, then at her. "I know," he said, and then he went back to work. His name, Claire would learn shortly, was Andre Mercer. The garage had been his father's before it was his, and his grandfather's before that. A 3-generation repair shop that had survived the interstate expansion, the big box auto chains, and the dealership consolidations of the past 2 decades through no particular strategy other than never closing. Andre didn't talk much. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone who has learned that unnecessary motion is just noise, and he had the kind of focus that makes a space feel quieter simply by being present in it. He stood beneath the raised hood of the Porsche for a long moment before he reached in. Not to disconnect anything, not to run a scan, just to place one hand flat against the transmission housing and hold it there. The gesture looked almost casual. It wasn't. Claire, leaning against the door of her car with her phone still in her hand, watched him and tried to decide whether she was witnessing genuine expertise or elaborate theater. She had been lied to enough times in the past week to distrust confidence. "Who told you the transmission was dead?" Andre asked, still facing the engine. "Every dealership in the city," Claire said. Andre was quiet for a moment. Then they didn't actually listen. The words were flat, not intended to wound, but they landed with a particular weight in the stillness of the garage lot. The girl, Zoe, Andre's daughter, had reappeared in the doorway and was watching the Porsche with the focused attention of someone who had grown up understanding that interesting problems came in all shapes. She didn't interrupt. She just watched her father work. On the workbench just inside the door, Claire noticed a single photograph tucked into the frame of the tool chest. A woman, laughing young, caught mid-motion, her hand blurred as if she'd been gesturing at something just out of frame. The photo was faded at the edges. It had clearly been there a long time. Andre hadn't mentioned it, and something in the way it sat there, neither displayed nor hidden, told Claire she wasn't meant to ask. Claire's phone buzzed. Brett Calloway. She let it go to voicemail, then watched it buzz again 30 seconds later. He had left a message she knew about the certified pre-owned 7ELE1, about how her decision window was closing, about how these things moved quickly. The thought of calling him back made her jaw tighten. She put the phone in her pocket. Andre had located a set of inspection leads from a worn tool chest and was running them along the undercarriage with a handheld light, tracing the wiring harness with a focus that seemed almost conversational. The way a person runs a finger along a map looking not for a destination, but for the place where something stopped making sense. He paused twice. The second time he stayed still for nearly a full minute, crouched beneath the car, the handheld light angled upward toward a cluster of connectors near the rear of the transmission housing. "It's not the transmission," he said, finally climbing back to his feet. Claire straightened. "Then what is it?" "Shift sensor module secondary feedback loop. It's sending the wrong load signal to the TCU. Transmission thinks it's under stress. It isn't actually experiencing, so it refuses to engage." He said this without drama, the way someone explains a thing they have understood for some time. Every shop that ran a standard diagnostic would have seen transmission fault codes because that's where the codes go. But the transmission itself is structurally sound. The part that's wrong is about the size of a matchbook. Claire stared at him. 4 service managers, 4 full diagnostics, $18,000 to $26,000, and it came down to something the size of a matchbook. "Can you fix it?" she asked. "The module's discontinued," Andre said. "Manufacturer stopped making it 8 years ago. But there are workarounds. Give me tonight." Zoe appeared at Andre's shoulder and looked at Claire without unkindness. "Dad only gets that quiet," she said, "when he's already figured it out." Andre didn't argue with this. He drank from a water bottle Zoe handed him, set it on the workbench ledge, and went back to the car. Claire stood in the cooling afternoon air outside Mercer Auto Repair and tried to organize what she was feeling. The rational part of her said to get a hotel for the night, let the man work, assume nothing. The part of her that had watched 4 different experts confidently diagnose the wrong problem said something else. That she wanted to understand how this had happened. Both the failure of the dealerships and the certainty of the man now methodically cataloging every connector in her father's car. She sent Brett Calloway a text. It said only, "I'll call you tomorrow." Then she went inside the garage to watch Andre Mercer work. The inside of Mercer Auto Repair was not what Claire had expected, though she couldn't have said precisely what she'd expected. A radio on the shelf played something instrumental, low and constant. The tool organization was immaculate despite the age of everything. Wrenches arranged by size. Diagnostic leads coiled in exactly the same direction. A hand-labeled parts drawer system running the length of one wall. It was the workspace of someone who had thought carefully about how to find things in the dark. Claire recognized that quality. She had it in her own office. It is the quality of people who have learned to rely entirely on themselves. Andre worked without talking unnecessarily. He had a way of moving around the Porsche that reminded Claire of watching a surgeon. Not the dramatic television version, but the real kind, efficient and unremarkable, where the skill is visible not in any single gesture, but in the total absence of wasted ones. He used no computerized scan tool after his initial assessment. He worked primarily through touch and sound, running his hands along surfaces, pressing test leads to connection points, listening with the same stillness he had shown outside. At one point, he held his ear near the transmission housing for nearly 2 minutes with the engine off, as though he could hear something in the metal itself. "You don't use a scanner?" Claire asked. "Used one to verify," Andre said. "Scanners tell you where the system recorded a problem. They don't tell you where the problem actually is." He held a test lead steady against a connector. Those are different questions. Claire had run a company for 6 years. She had sat across from consultants, analysts, auditors, and engineers, and she knew the difference between people who understood a system and people who had memorized a protocol. Andre Mercer understood the system. She had known it since the first 30 seconds on the shoulder of the road, and standing in his garage, it became impossible to pretend otherwise. She asked Zoe during a moment when Andre had gone to the back room to search the parts inventory how long he had been doing this. Zoe was cleaning a torque wrench with the focused efficiency of a kid who had grown up doing it. "Forever," she said, which was a child's answer, but also Claire suspected not entirely inaccurate. "He used to work with race cars," Zoe added with the casual precision of someone stating a well-known fact before. Claire didn't ask what before meant. She had heard enough to infer. The garage had the particular atmosphere of a place shaped by a single significant change. Not ruin exactly, but redirection. The kind of space where someone very capable had chosen to scale down rather than up, and had built a life at that smaller scale with a deliberateness that made it feel more intentional than most successes. What Claire would learn gradually through Zoe's spare comments and Andre's occasional deflections was that he had spent the better part of a decade as a transmission systems engineer for a mid-level endurance racing team. He had been, by all available accounts, exceptional. Not the loudest voice in the room, but consistently the most accurate one. The kind of specialist who gets called when something has failed in a way no one can explain and everyone else has already tried. He had navigated with the same quiet resolution he brought to everything else spaces that had not always been designed to take someone like him seriously. He had earned every room he entered twice over. Then his wife Rachel had been diagnosed with a progressive illness, and then she had died, and Andre had walked away from the racing circuit and driven back to his hometown with Zoe and the deed to his father's garage and no stated plan beyond being present for his daughter. He had never gone back, not to racing, not to engineering, not to any of the consulting offers that had arrived in the first 2 years, and then gradually stopped. He had opened the garage and fixed cars for people in the surrounding county and charged less than he should, and lived simply, and raised Zoe, and anyone who drove past on the county road would have seen nothing more than a small, quiet repair shop that had been there for 3 generations. Cars talk, Andre said at one point, returning from the parts room with a small cardboard box in one hand and a pencil-sketched diagram in the other. Most people just stopped listening. He said it without emphasis, not as a philosophy, but as a simple observation. The way a person states something so obvious to them that they forget it might not be obvious to everyone else. Claire wrote it down on the back of a receipt from her purse. She wasn't sure why. It felt important in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. By the time the clock on the wall read just past 11, the garage had taken on a different quality. Closer, warmer, the radio still going, and the light overhead buzzing faintly. Zoe had fallen asleep on a folded blanket in the back office, one arm tucked under her head, a worn paperback open beside her. Andre worked on. At 2 in the morning, without announcement or fanfare, he found it. The shift sensor module's secondary feedback unit, discontinued. 8 years prior, had developed a hairline fracture in one of its internal feedback pathways. Not enough to trigger a catastrophic failure, enough to produce exactly the kind of intermittent escalating fault signal that every diagnostic system would read as transmission distress. Every dealership had done exactly what their training told them to do. Andre had done something their training hadn't covered. He had kept listening past where the machine stopped talking. He set the module on the workbench under the good light and examined it with a jeweler's loupe for a long moment without speaking. Claire watched from near the tool chest, fatigue beginning to settle into her shoulders. She had been awake for nearly 20 hours. She had been fighting this problem for a week. She was standing in a garage on the edge of the county in the middle of the night watching a man she had met 6 hours ago hold a component smaller than a cigarette lighter under a magnifying lens. And she felt absurdly that something was about to resolve. "This is what killed it," Andre said. He tilted the module so Claire could see the area he was studying. There was a hairline fracture barely visible to the naked eye running diagonally across one of the connector pathways. To anyone who wasn't looking for it specifically, it would appear to be a slight imperfection in the casing. Every fault code the transmission threw was downstream of this. The transmission was defending itself against a signal that wasn't real. Claire studied the part for a moment. The dealerships saw the transmission fault codes and stopped there, Andre said, which is what the diagnostic software tells them to do. Replace the transmission clear, the codes move on. None of them pulled the sensor harness. None of them traced the fault signal back to the source, because the software said the source was the transmission. He paused. The software was wrong. The statement was simple. It landed hard. $26,000. 4 service departments. 4 printed estimates. 4 confident professionals. And the answer had been a matchbook-sized component with a crack so fine it required a loupe to confirm. "Can you fix it?" Claire asked again, the same question from earlier, but different now that she could see what she was asking about. Andre nodded. "The module itself can't be repaired, the fractures in a conductor pathway, but I found a compatible unit in the parts room. Old stock, different vehicle application, but the feedback architecture is close enough. I can remap the signal calibration on the bench, swap the housing, and install it in about 2 hours. He said this the way someone describes a task they've done before. Not identical circumstances, perhaps, but close enough to know the shape of the work. He went to the back office and woke Zoe with a gentle hand on her shoulder. She came awake immediately, no confusion, like someone accustomed to being called at odd hours for work that mattered. Andre told her what he needed in 2 sentences. She nodded, went to the parts storage, and returned 6 minutes later with a small bin of connectors sorted by gauge. The efficiency between them was wordless, and practiced the rhythm of people who have worked alongside each other long enough to share a language below speech. Claire watched them work. Zoe held the work light. Andre's hands moved through the connector housing with the precision of someone performing a procedure, not improvising one. He recalibrated the signal parameters on the replacement unit using a reference chart he had drawn from memory onto the notepad, cross-checking twice before soldering anything. At 4:17 in the morning, Andre closed the hood of the Porsche. He wiped his hands on a shop cloth, leaned against the front fender for a moment, and then handed Claire the keys. "You figured that out in one night," she said. "I figured it out in 5 minutes," Andre said. "It took the rest of the night to fix it." Claire looked at him. There was no performance in his face, no pride, no expectation of reaction, no awareness that what he had just described was anything other than ordinary. It was the expression of someone who has been doing excellent work in obscurity for so long that excellence had stopped feeling exceptional. She turned the key. The Porsche engine came alive with a sound that was immediate and clean, and without hesitation settling into a steady idle that had none of the shuddering reluctance of the past week. She shifted through every gear. Smooth, perfect, each one engaging without protest. The transmission moving through its range as though nothing had ever been wrong. Because, as Andre had said from the first moment, nothing had. She sat in the driver's seat with the engine running and the garage lights warm against the darkness outside. Zoe had climbed back onto her folded blanket and was already half asleep again. Andre was returning his tools to the chest with the same quiet precision he had used to take them out. The radio played on. "How much do I owe you?" Claire asked. Andre named a figure that was a 20th of the lowest dealership estimate. Claire wrote the check with a shaking hand. She drove back into the city as the sun was coming up and the Porsche moved beneath her like a different machine. Which it wasn't, of course, which was precisely the point. It had always been capable of this. It had simply been failed repeatedly and expensively by people who had trusted their systems more than the evidence in front of them. The satisfaction Claire felt was complicated. Part of it was relief. Part of it was the specific fury of someone who has been systematically misled by authority. And part of it was something quieter, a gratitude that didn't know quite where to land. When you encounter someone whose credentials don't match their location, whose certainty seems out of proportion to their surroundings, try not to let the setting make the judgment before you do. Expertise doesn't always arrive in the packaging we've been trained to expect. And sometimes the most honest thing a person can tell you is simply, "I listened." She had barely gotten home and showered when her phone lit up with a message from Diana Wells, a journalist and automotive enthusiast who had covered the city's luxury car market for 3 years and had written critically about dealership service practices on more than one occasion. Claire and Diana had met at a business function 18 months prior and maintained the low-heat friendship of 2 busy people who respected each other's competence. Claire had texted her from the garage at 2 o'clock in the morning, not sure why, only knowing that something worth documenting had happened. Diana had already been to Mercer Auto Repair by the time Claire got home. She had arrived just after dawn, spoken with Andre, briefly photographed the Porsche and the garage and the discontinued sensor module sitting on the workbench, and posted the story before 7. The headline was straightforward. Luxury dealerships failed. Old garage fixed it overnight. The story was precise and detailed, naming the 4 dealerships, describing the misdiagnosis, explaining in plain language what Andre had found and how he had found it. It named the price difference. It named Brett Calloway's facility specifically. The response was immediate. Claire watched it happen from her kitchen table, her 3rd coffee cooling beside her. The story moved fast, not through any single dramatic moment, but through the particular momentum of something that touches a nerve many people have been waiting to see touched. Within hours, automotive forums were filling with similar stories, similar experiences, similar diagnoses that had cost thousands of dollars before someone found a better mechanic. The narrative had a shape that people recognized. By afternoon, the first car arrived at Mercer Auto Repair that hadn't come via breakdown or word of mouth. A man in a Range Rover had driven 40 minutes from the west side of the city after reading Diana's story describing a persistent hesitation that 3 shops had attributed to fuel injector failure. By the time the second car arrived, a Maserati with an electrical fault its dealership had quoted $8,000 to diagnose, Andre had stopped looking surprised and started keeping a list. The supercars came gradually at first, then with a momentum that felt almost geological, slow, enormous, unstoppable. A McLaren and Aston Martin with a fault that 2 certified technicians had failed to trace. A Ferrari belonging to a collector who had been told by the manufacturer's service center that a specific drivetrain component was irreparable without a full rebuild. The owners arrived tentatively expecting a certain kind of gap between their cars and the setting, and they left converted, which is the word that fits best. Not just satisfied, but structurally changed in their understanding of where expertise actually lives. Zoe watched from the garage doorway one afternoon as 7 vehicles she couldn't have named 3 months ago sat in the Mercer Auto Repair lot at once. Their owners standing in clusters talking to each other in the way that people do when they have shared an unexpected discovery. She turned to her father, who was wiping his hands on a shop cloth and studying the lot with an expression that was not quite pride and not quite overwhelm, but something between them. "Told you people would come someday," she said. Andre looked at his daughter for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "You did." Brett Calloway had not taken the public reversal with any of the equanimity one might have hoped for. He had watched Diana's story spread with an attention that moved quickly from irritation to calculation. Calloway had spent 7 years building his dealership's reputation on exactly the kind of authority the story was dismantling. A service department with 4 certified technicians, 3 diagnostic systems, and a per-hour labor rate that reflected all of it. The idea that a one-man garage on a county road had done in one night what his team had failed to do in a 20-minute diagnostic appointment was not something he experienced as a learning opportunity. The calls he made over the following days were to people he knew in the city's automotive licensing office, to a journalist contact who covered business compliance rather than automotive culture, and to 2 other dealership owners who had been named in Diana's follow-up pieces. The conversations were not directly actionable, but they had a direction, and that direction was toward Andre Mercer. A week after Diana's first story, a car that defied everything Mercer Auto Repair had ever serviced was towed to the lot. It was a Ferrari of a model so specific and so rare that it had no business being on a county road outside the city. The driver was a man named Richard Hale, who had gotten Andre's name from a collector in his network and had driven 4 hours to get here. He stood beside the car with his arms folded, watching the tow operator unhitch it, and looked at Andre with an expression that was not quite a test and not quite a greeting, but somewhere between them. Andre looked at the car. Then he looked at Hale. Then he walked over and opened the hood. Richard Hale was not the kind of man who arrived anywhere without knowing something about where he was going. He was 61 years old, retired from a career that had moved between automotive engineering endurance racing and investment in motorsport technology, and he had the particular bearing of someone who has been around exceptional talent long enough to recognize it quickly. He had heard Andre Mercer's name twice before arriving, once from a former racing contact who had said carefully that Andre was someone the industry had let go of without fully understanding what it had lost. The second time from the Ferrari collector who had simply said, "He'll hear it." Hale had driven 4 hours and hadn't doubted it once. What he hadn't expected was the storm he was walking into. 3 days after Hale arrived, Brett Calloway made his move. An automotive trade publication ran a story citing anonymous sources claiming that Mercer Auto Repair had sourced components through unauthorized supply channels. The word used was not stolen technically, but the implication was arranged precisely. A compliance officer from the city's business licensing division scheduled an inspection of the garage. 2 of Calloway's service managers gave on-record statements about the risks of having unlicensed work performed on high-value vehicles. The inspection arrived on a Tuesday morning. Two officials with clipboards walked through the garage for 90 minutes, while Andre stood to one side at the shop counter, and half a dozen cars sat in various states of service. The officials photographed the parts inventory, the tools, the documentation system, the workbench. Andre answered every question without legal counsel, without alarm, and without a single answer that was anything other than exactly what had actually happened. The parts he used were old stock, legally acquired, sourced from supplier networks he had maintained for 15 years. The documentation was meticulous, handwritten, cross-referenced, dated. When the inspectors left, they left with nothing actionable. But the story had already moved, not the inspection. The implication, the insinuation floating through the automotive forums, and the business coverage that maybe the garage's methods were unorthodox in ways that warranted concern. I've thought about this part of the story more than any other. Not the car, not the showcase, not the sign at the end. This part. Because the attack didn't come when Andre failed. It came when he succeeded in a way that made the right people uncomfortable. That tells you something worth knowing, not about Andre, but about the systems around him. A man who had quietly kept his head down for years became a threat the moment he became visible. That's not an accident. That's a pattern. Claire had watched it happen from a distance that felt too comfortable, and she knew it. She was a CEO navigating a company through a difficult quarter with investors watching and relationships to protect, and she had several good professional reasons to let the controversy settle before she positioned herself clearly on one side of it. She sat in her car outside the garage on a Thursday afternoon and looked at the door and tried to decide what kind of person she was. She had spent a week watching a man she barely knew provide extraordinary service for people he had never met in a garage that had every material disadvantage and no institutional support. And she had benefited directly from his talent in a way she hadn't properly acknowledged publicly. The calculation of what that acknowledgement might cost her professionally was real. It was also, when she sat with it, honestly less important than she had been treating it. She got out of the car and went inside. Richard Hale was there, as it turned out, having become something of a fixture in the garage over the past week. He was sitting at the shop counter with a coffee Andre had made and a set of technical documentation spread in front of him. When Claire walked in, something in his expression shifted toward the look of a man whose timing had just improved considerably. What Hale told them. Andre, Claire, and Zoe, who had come in from the back at the sound of the front door, was not new information to him, but was new to most of the people currently forming opinions about Andre Mercer. He told them about an endurance race 8 years ago in which a catastrophic transmission failure had been predicted by every technical analyst on the team. He told them that the only person who had disagreed with that prediction was a transmission engineer who had listened to the car during a practice lap, pulled the team principal aside, and said with complete calm that the transmission was not failing, that a sensor cascade was manufacturing a false crisis, and that if they trusted it, they would make a costly and unnecessary decision. The team had listened. The prediction had been right. The race had continued. The engineer had received no public credit because the crisis had, from the outside, simply not occurred. The engineer was Andre. They called him transmission genius, Hale said matter-of-factly. Internally, in the circles that knew, he looked at Andre. You know that. Andre was quiet for a moment. Didn't seem relevant. It's relevant now. Claire said the work was the same whether anyone knew or not. Andre said he paused, and what followed arrived without self-pity, without calculation, without any apparent awareness that it might be the most meaningful thing said aloud in the garage since the first night. I stopped chasing that kind of success when my daughter needed a father more than the sport needed an engineer. Zoe was looking at the floor with the specific expression of a child who has heard this sentence before in various forms and still doesn't quite know what to do with it. Claire was looking at Andre with an expression she didn't entirely control. She made 2 calls that afternoon. The first was to Diana Wells. The second was to the organizers of the city's annual automotive industry showcase, a one-day event drawing manufacturers, collectors, engineers, and press from across the region. It was scheduled for 10 days out. Claire had been invited as a guest speaker in her capacity as CEO. She called and asked whether there was room to add one more name to the program. There was a pause on the line. Then the organizer said yes, of course. And who did she have in mind? Andre Mercer, Claire said. Mercer Auto Repair. He's a transmission specialist. She thought about Hale's description. Actually, she said you might want to lead with that. Staying silent when someone we trust is being treated unfairly is never truly neutral. It's a choice, and it has a cost. Not always a visible one, but one we feel precisely in moments like the one Claire sat through in that car. We can't always fix every wrong, but we can usually decide not to look away from the ones right in front of us. The automotive showcase was held in a convention space at the edge of downtown. Floor-to-ceiling glass along one wall, 2 rows of elevated display platforms, a main stage area with brand flags that moved in the air conditioning. The city's automotive community turned out in the particular blend of the genuinely passionate and the professionally interested collectors, dealers, engineers, manufacturers' representatives, journalists. Brett Calloway was there, which Claire had expected, in a front row position that suggested he had arranged to be noticed. He had brought 2 of his service managers and was working the room with the energy of someone who has decided that visible confidence is all that remains to him. Andre arrived in his truck. He parked at the far end of the lot, walked in alone, and stood near the back of the main hall looking at the cars on the display platforms with an expression of uncomplicated interest. He was wearing a clean shirt, the work kind, not the dress kind. And he looked in this setting exactly like what he was, a working mechanic at a formal industry event present, because he had been asked and not particularly concerned with what that meant. Diana had filed her piece the night before. Hale had made 3 calls to contacts in the motorsport community. The narrative had a shape and a momentum now, and its shape was not good for Brett Calloway. The first panel session ran without incident. The second featured a manufacturer's representative presenting on the future of electronic drivetrain monitoring, which generated polite interest and several technical questions. Andre asked one of them a quiet, specific question about the limits of sensor-based diagnostics in detecting intermittent pathway faults that caused the presenter to pause, then answer more carefully than he had planned to. The crisis happened 40 minutes into the third session. A supercar, a limited production model that had arrived that morning as part of the display brought by its owner specifically for the event, simply stopped working. Not dramatically, not with smoke or sound. It started on cue for the demonstration and then without warning refused to shift out of park. Every light on the dashboard was clean. Every system indicator was normal. The car was by all diagnostic evidence perfectly functional and completely unable to move. The event organizers brought in the manufacturer's certified technician who had arrived with the car. He ran a full scan for 14 minutes. 3 other service technicians from dealerships in attendance were invited to look. 2 of Calloway's service managers examined it. The consensus after 30 minutes and 4 separate diagnostic systems was that the onboard electronics had experienced a software cascade and that the car would need to be transported to a certified facility for a full system reset, a process that would take conservatively 3 to 4 days. Calloway had positioned himself near the front by this point, watching the diagnosis unfold with an expression calibrated between sympathy and authority. He had already started a sentence about the limitations of mechanical expertise in the face of modern electronic systems when Claire crossed the hall. She found Andre near the back wall, still holding his coffee. "I need you to look at something," she said. He read her expression, set down the coffee, and followed her to the car. The hall had settled into the particular quiet of a room full of people who have decided to watch what happens next. Andre stood in front of the car for a moment, then crouched and looked through the driver's window at the dashboard display. He stood up. He looked at the wheel wells. He crouched again and held his position near the rear quarter panel for a long time. A technician standing nearby offered a diagnostic tablet. Andre waved it off gently. Then he asked the car owner to open the hood. He stood above the engine for 20 seconds, both hands on the edge of the engine bay, completely still. Then he reached in and pressed one hand against the side of the mechatronic unit housing the component that managed the integration between the electronic shift signals and the mechanical transmission execution. He held it there, Then, without explanation, he asked for a standard inspection mirror and a thin test lead. What he found 2 minutes later was a ground wire, specifically a ground wire in the mechatronic harness that had developed intermittent contact failure due to a microfracture at the crimp point, invisible to external inspection, producing no fault code because the grounding failure was partial rather than complete. The system's electronics were functioning. The mechanical pathway was functioning. The communication between them was working at 92% integrity. The missing 8% was precisely enough to prevent the shift engagement from completing. Andre held up the failed crimp connector so the room could see it. It was the size of a fingernail. He asked for a crimp tool. Someone in the audience had one in a kit under his display table. Andre repaired the connection in 40 seconds, verified the ground continuity with a test lead, closed the hood, and nodded to the car's owner. The owner started the car, shifted smoothly into drive, and the car moved forward without hesitation. The hall was completely silent. Then a technician standing near the display platform, one of the certified professionals who had spent the past 40 minutes studying the car, asked the question everyone was thinking. "How did you know?" Andre straightened up and looked across the car at the gathered room. "Because you listen to computers," he said. "I listen to the car." No one said anything for a moment. Then someone started to clap. Then the rest of the room followed. Calloway was already moving toward the exit by the time the sound filled the hall. The weeks that followed did not transform Mercer Auto Repair into something it had never been. That was important. Andre did not franchise. He did not hire a staff. He did not move to a bigger building or change the sign or start charging more than the work was worth. The garage stayed exactly what it was. A low concrete building on a county road, hand-painted sign, folding metal chair beside the door, 2 lifts and a tool chest, and a radio that played something instrumental in the background. What changed was the line outside it. They came from the city and from beyond the city in vehicles whose names would have seemed implausible on that crumbling lot a year ago. They came because the story had done what true stories do when they travel far enough. Not merely entertained, but persuaded. Persuaded people that the distance between expertise and credential is not always the narrow gap they've been trained to assume. That the best person for a job is sometimes the least officially designated one. That listening, which sounds simple and is not, is its own form of genius. Claire became, in the words of a business profile Diana published 2 months after the showcase, the garage's most prominent advocate. A description Claire found accurate in the same way most accurate descriptions feel slightly smaller than the thing they describe. She had been changed by what she witnessed in a way she had not been changed by most things. She referred business contacts when their vehicles needed serious attention. She spoke about Andre at an industry conference with an absence of embellishment that was more convincing than praise. Brett Calloway's position at his dealership did not survive the year. The compliance review that his own machinations had helped initiate expanded turned around and found its way back to his service department's documentation practices. The investigation was quiet, and the separation was formal, and the announcement used the phrase mutual agreement, which is the language organizations use when the truth is something else entirely. Calloway was gone by November. Richard Hale came back twice more, once with a car, once just to talk. He and Andre had the conversations that 2 people have when they've spent years in the same field from different positions and have only now found themselves in the same room long enough to compare notes. Hale had offers to extend networks, to introduce opportunities, to suggest. Andre listened to all of them with the courtesy and the quiet resolution of someone who has already made his peace with where he is. Zoe made the sign on a Saturday afternoon in late autumn, working at the shop counter with a piece of cardboard and a set of permanent markers, the old sign propped against the wall beside her. She had thought about what to put on it for several days. Not the name, which stayed the same, but the line beneath it. When she was done, she carried it outside and nailed it over the door. Andre came out to look at it, wiping his hands on the shop cloth he always carried. The sign read, Mercer Auto Repair. We listened first. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Zoe stood beside him with her arms crossed, watching his face. "Well?" she said. Andre looked at his daughter. Then he looked back at the sign. "Yeah," he said. "That works." The day ended the way most days ended at Mercer Auto Repair. The light going amber and long across the cracked lot. The radio audible from inside. A line of vehicles waiting that would have looked incongruous here a year ago. Porsches and Ferraris and things rarer than both. Parked in a row outside a garage that had no appointment system and no receptionist, and no diagnostic bay, and no floor-to-ceiling glass. Claire had stopped by that evening for no particular reason except that she was nearby and wanted to. She stood in the doorway and watched Andre close the hood of the last car in the bay, the sound solid and clean. She looked at the lot outside the cars, the fading light, the hand-painted sign that had always been there, and the new one above the door. "Still think I should buy a new car," she said. Andre wiped his hands on the shop cloth. He turned and looked at the Porsche parked closest to the door exactly where it belonged. "Only if you stop listening," he said. He turned back to the work. The most enduring thing Andre built wasn't a reputation or a following or even a business. It was a daughter who grew up watching someone do right by the work every day, regardless of who was watching. That's a kind of inheritance that doesn't show up on any estimate, but it's the one that lasts.